mentioned a couple of videos back that I'm what is known as a full stack developer, which is to say that I write code on the server, on the back end, in C#, in .NET, and also for the browser, which I've done in various different languages and systems, but nowadays it's mostly in Angular. And although I've shown you examples, the vast majority of .NET, but also recently a few Angular examples, I haven't really shown this whole full stack approach of linking them together. So over the next few videos, I was going to show you the whole thing from the back end through to the front end, how they interconnect, and then we'll see a number of features both of .NET and Angular and how we can make them work. So just to emphasize the situation that we're in, if we take a look at the system we have so far, this is what I'd written in .NET, which is an MVC application. So we can see it works. Remember, we've got this system I've been building up where we have a load of individual book reviews, and then we've got a summary that just gives us the average over all those reviews for each book. And that was written in MVC, and the problem with that is it's entirely really a server-side technology. So each of these pages that you see is generated as HTML on the server, sent to the browser, which simply displays it. Now you can add some browser functionality onto that using various libraries you might want to have a go with, but essentially it's a server-side technology. And then we also had this, which was my Angular app doing the same thing. So the styling is a bit different, but it's exactly the same functionality. But the problem with that, as far as it went, was that I hadn't actually hooked it up to a server at all. So we can see that we had all of that data simply hard-coded within the Angular code, which was nice to get things going, but it's not a very realistic way of programming. So what I'm going to do over the next few videos is hook those two together, give us a realistic full stack application going right through from a database, through a web service, out to Angular. And this week we're going to begin that by putting together the web service side of that. So that's what I've got here. So here I've created the basics of the data access. So I've got this data access layer, nothing new here at all. This has just got a book review class, and then it's got a DB context to get that out of a database using Entity Framework. So if you're not familiar with Entity Framework, I've done loads of videos on that. Follow the link and have a look at that. And then I've also introduced this idea of a book repository, which just wraps up that DB context and presents it to the rest of the application. We used this basically in that MVC app to get at the data, but then also to display it as HTML. Here, we just want to present the data to the outside world. And so what I'm going to do is add to this solution the actual web service. So we'll do a new project, and we will select a SP.NET Core Web API. So that's what they call their web services. And we will call this the Book Review API. Click next on that, and then most of these will leave as the default. So we're at .NET 5, latest version of .NET. Not going to bother with authentication, not going to bother with Docker. But then the thing I'm going to leave switched on here is this enable open API support. This only came in recently, I think. I can't remember exactly when it came in, but we'll see why that's so useful when we actually come onto it. It's related, as the help there shows, to a thing called Swagger, and we'll see how that's really helpful when you are developing web APIs. So we'll hit create on that. And so now we've got our basic book review, and it gives us this thing called a weather forecast controller, which is just the basic web API example that you can base your code upon. And if you want to, you might want to modify that, but I'm going to delete it and write the whole thing from scratch for my book reviews. So the steps we need to take, well, first thing is we just need to add a dependency. So from our API to that data access layer that we've already written. We then also need to pop in some NuGet packages. So we've got to have access to the database. You can see it's already installed this thing called Swashbuckle. That's related to Swagger that I was just mentioning. But what we want to look at is Entity Framework Core, and then the three libraries we need to get hold of. We need to get hold of Entity Framework Core itself. We need to get hold of Entity Framework Core.relational. And then also we need to get hold of SQLite, because that's the particular database that I'm going to be using. So we add all of those in there. And then you'll notice also I've pre-prepared this books.db, so that's the actual SQLite database that contains just those basic books that we've been looking at. And so I'll just drag that into our API, so we've got that in there. And then one other bit of prep that I've got to do is make sure that in startup we've got all of that configured correctly. So I need to put in the connection to that actual database, so that's services.add DB context, and remember that's the thing I was just showing you, that's our book review DB context. Get hold of the namespace for that, and then just do a bit of configuration on that. So we're going to say options gives, and then here we just specify the actual database that we want, so options dot use SQLite. Again, get hold of the namespace. And then we just configure that as file name equals, and then books.db, which was the file I just dragged in there. So that's set up our DB context. You'll also notice we've got this repository, the iBook review repository, and then the actual book review repository, and that needs to be configured for dependency injection. Again, we looked at this on an earlier video, which is what kind of led on to all of this. So if we do services and then add transient, and then we say whenever somebody asks for an iBook review repository, again we need to get the namespace. So whenever they ask for one, we give them an actual book review repository. So that's configured everything that will get it all going. So now all we need to do is actually start writing some code so that we've got our web API to present that data. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go to the controllers folder where I just deleted that weather controller, and we'll add our new controller. And this, I'm going to go for an API controller, the empty API controller. You could use these other ones which will do some scaffolding for you, but I'd like to write it from scratch so we can see what's going on. We then need to name it, so we're going to call it the book review controller. Click add, and it generates this basic empty class that we now have as our controller. And you can see the root it's got there. It has API / square brackets controller. So by putting that square brackets controller, it basically says take the name of the class minus the word controller. So we don't want that on the URL, but we do want it on the class. You could have hard-coded book review in there, but it just means you've got to change it every time. But the thing I'm not going to have here, actually, I'm going to get rid of that API, because I only really use API as a root folder if I've got both a web service and a website, and it distinguishes them. But when you've got a pure web service, it seems unnecessary to me to be putting that API in there. But now what we're going to do is we're just going to get this started. First thing we've got to do is have the injection. So we're going to have a private iBook review repository. Get hold of the namespace again. And we'll just call that _repos. And then we need to have a constructor. And that is just going to set up this repository. So again, dependency injection, just like we've seen it in the earlier examples. Then we're going to put in our first endpoint. So an endpoint is something that can be called from the client to get data from the server. Now, what we're going to do here is write what is known as a Restful API. Restful, short for representational state transfer. And so what that means is a number of things. It's quite a vague, broad set of ideas. But in terms of writing the API, it means that we focus the API on the type of data that we're going to be returning or processing. And in this case, that's book review. But then we also write methods that deal with what are the four fundamental known as CRUD operations, C-R-U-D, which are the operations we have with data. And if we just take a look at our repository, we can see we've actually already got that, because the CRUD stands for create when you're creating a new object, read when you're reading data, update when you're modifying data, and delete when you are deleting data. Those are the four CRUD operations, and they relate to databases and all sorts of other situations when you're dealing with data. And when you've got a RESTful API, it follows that idea, but it uses slightly different names for it because it uses the 4 key HTTP verbs as they're known. So when you send a request to a web service, you send this thing called a verb that could be either get or post or put or delete. And those actually relate exactly with different names to the 4 CRUD operations. So get is read, post is create, put is update, and delete, obviously enough, is delete. And so that's what we use to put this together. And so I'll start out because it's the first thing you want to do with our read. So what we do is we put on an attribute, HTTP get. So this is saying this is going to respond to any GET requests. And then we can say public. And then we say action result. So that's the class we've got for there. And then the type of data we're going to return, well, this is going to get all of the data. So here we want an I enumerable of our book review class. And so that's what we've got there. And then we can actually call this method absolutely whatever we like. Because we've said it's going to respond to the get verb, we'll see actually the name of it is just an internal thing in our program, not something external. So I'm going to call it get book reviews, but that's never going to be exposed, as we'll see, to the outside world. And then in this case, all we need to do is we return. And then another very important thing about a RESTful website is it's quite strict on returning the relevant status codes to say what's gone on. So in this case, when we've got the books, we're going to return OK, and that is provided through this helper method, comes from that controller base class. So we say OK, and then we pass in the data that we want to return. And so in this case, we've got our repository and we've got this read that just gives us back all of the data. And so that's all we need to do. And so that actually now is pretty much there. Let's just make sure we set that to our startup project and go for the in-process server and then run that up. And here's where we see this really nice thing called Swagger. Because what that Swagger edition has done for us is generated this page that allows us to interrogate the web service API. Because obviously the point of an API is it doesn't have any pages associated with it, it's just data. And that's great when you're using it, but it's not much fun when you are doing development. And so that's why we've got this here. Also, other tools you can use, things like Postman and Advanced REST Client, which are separate tools to do that, and they certainly do still have their place. But since this has been introduced, it makes testing really easy. The thing is, if I were to just to go to localhost 5001 and then to our controller, which is book review, because it was book review controller, but we take that off. Then we do see we get the data, and that's just some JSON data showing what we wanted. And that's reasonably good. But the problem with that is it's only useful really for doing a get, because that's what a browser always does. When you put an address in the address bar of a browser, it does a get, which isn't as useful as we'll see when we add the other ones as well. So instead, we have this Swagger approach because it's showing us so much more. It's showing us things like what the data structure to expect back is. So we've got an ID, we've got a title, and we've got a rating. So it's giving us that information. And it also gives us the ability to test that. So if I drop that down, we can see it's not expecting any parameters. It's showing us a sample of the text we could get back. And if I do try it out and click execute, same sort of result we did if we went there directly, but we can see it's rather more friendly to use. So it's a really good tool when you're developing for making sure that your API is working. So let's now add those other operations. And in fact, the first one we're going to add is a second get, because although we talk about CRUD or we talk about the verbs in HTTP, the read, the get, almost always will have two versions, because we have this one that is a get all, and then we also want to get an individual one, typically by ID. So I'm going to change the name of that to Get Book Review by ID. And then in here, I will just take the parameter of int ID. And then on here, I've got an overload of read actually that also takes the ID. So we can see that in there. I can just pop that on. But we do have to do one other thing, which is let the system know that the URL that requests this is going to take the ID. So it's still going to use the get verb, but what we then have to put in here is an additional parameter looking like this, which just is in curly braces and then ID. So the curly braces are saying this is not literally something you're going to see in the URL. This is a parameter that's going to take on a particular value. But simple as that. Make sure you put it in the URL and then pass it in. Those two have to be the same name, but then you can do whatever you like. And so now, if we run it up, we see that we've got the two gets and it's shown us what that URL should look like. So if we run the first get, we can see what the IDs are. So let's say go for ID number 4. And so if we close that one up and open the second get, this time when we try it out, it's given us a field where we can put that ID in there. So I'll put number 4 in there and we can see we're getting back just that individual one. So this swagger is a really nice way to go about things. So that's our two gets. Let's now do the other operations. So the next one we're going to have an HTTP post. Remember, post is create. So when we do a post, we don't have any parameters in the URL. We're going to have a public. This time it's just going to be an action result. And we'll call this create book review. Again, we saw these names don't matter. They're just for internal consumption. And that is going to take as a parameter the book review that we want to create. So what I do, I put in here from body, because this is going to be part of the body of the request, not part of the URL. And then I'll just say book review. And then all we need to do now is just say underscore repos.create, pass that review straight in there. And then also, what do we return? Well, again, when you're following these RESTful principles, the idea when you create an object, what you should return is a response to say you've successfully created it, but also you should have the URL where, once it's been created, it can be retrieved from. Now, there's various ways we can do this, but the one I'm going to use here is we've got a thing called created at action, and that's something that the .NET Web API system uses to construct this URL, because what we can put in there is we can do a name of, and then remember where we're going to find it is in get book review ID. So that's what we have there. And then we say new, and then we specify what the parameter should be. So ID equals review.id. Thing to remember that Entity Framework does for us rather nicely here is when we do that create, it will sign into the review the ID that the database generates for it. So that's what we've got there. And then we also just pop in the value of that. So again, review.id. While I'm here, let's just get the other ones done as well. So we'll have our HTTP put. Now put, again, needs to take the ID because we need to know the ID of the thing we're modifying. Remember, put means update. So that's what we have there. But then it's also going to have a body because as well as knowing what you're going to update, you want to know the new values. So this one actually takes two parameters. And we'll call this update book review. So what we're going to do is once again simply call the method on the repository that I'd already written. So update, and again that takes the ID and the review. And then simply returns OK again. So you can see most of the work is done by our repository. We're just hooking everything together here, which allows us to focus on what the Web API does. And then finally, we will have our HTTP delete, which takes an ID, doesn't take a body because we're just deleting it by ID. And so we just say here, delete, and we've got that done. So really pretty straightforward to get those all together. Run that up. And we can now see we've got quite a rich interface there. So Swagger is showing us all of those operations. And so now if let's go for the post, for example, and you can see that it gives us this template for the body, obviously not got the correct values in there, but we can just fill these in. So let's do another review for Dr. No. Don't fill in the ID because we saw that's provided for us. Let's give Dr. No a rating of 1 and then again click execute. And two things to notice. One is there, remember, is where it's telling us where to find this new created review. And in fact, we could just take that and pop it in there and we get that one result for Dr. No. Or we could do it through the get that we've got in Swagger. So if we do the get for a single review, pop 13 in there, and we get back that result. Or we could go for a put, so let's modify that. Let's say we made a mistake. So we go for that ID of 13, still going to be Dr. No. We could actually change the book there, which you may or may not want to do, but it's possible. And then let's re-rate that as a 5, execute that, all okay. Again, if we look at the get, re-execute that, we can now see we've got a rating of 5 in there. And then the last thing to do is if we just do a delete again on the one we created there, execute that. And then if we try to just have a look at the get on all of them again and scroll down the bottom, we can see we've lost that number 13. So that was it for our first approach to a RESTful web API. And there's a few more things we can do. We may look at those in a later video, particularly in terms of handling error conditions and that sort of thing. Like suppose we requested a book review that didn't exist at all. We'll look at those in a later video. But the next thing we're going to do is then hook that up to the front end, because it's all very well for a developer, particularly if you're a developer who's purely focused on the back end, to have a tool like Swagger. But really, we want to take this data and we want to put it into our Angular applications so that we can see real data and do the summaries and all that sort of thing. And so that's what we'll be looking at next time. But hope you enjoyed that. Do click subscribe, do click like, and I'll see you for the next look at Angular.